Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Hoagland, Assistant Trade Specialist at the Massachusetts Export Center. Thank you for joining us today for Buy versus Build, Considerations for Evaluating AI-Based Trade Compliance Technology Solutions. This webinar is being recorded and will be emailed to attendees within a few days after the program. Just a quick note that all participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar. Though you may notice the chat option in your webinar toolbar, chat is disabled. If you have any questions, please submit them as they arise by using the Q&A function, which may be found behind the More button on your Zoom controls. Questions will be collected throughout the webinar and answered at the end of the program. Lastly, once the webinar has ended, a new tab will appear in your browser with our training evaluation. We ask that you please take a few moments to tell us if the webinar met your needs. Once the evaluation is submitted, a certificate of completion will be emailed to you, which you may print and retain for your records. We appreciate any feedback that you may have. And now I will pass it off to Julia Dvorko to get us started.
Thank you, Jason, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julia Dvorko, Regional Director at the Massachusetts Export Center, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on Buy versus Build, Considerations for Evaluating AI-Based Trade Compliance Technology Solutions. In an increasingly complex global trade and regulatory environment, companies are challenged not only to keep pace, but to strategically adopt AI-enabled technologies that create competitive advantage. The decision to build or buy these solutions is inherently multi-layered, spanning functions such as compliance, IT operations, and strategy. This webinar will provide a practical framework for evaluating the build versus buy decision in the context of rapidly evolving regulations, global market dynamics, and emerging technologies. Participants will gain greater clarity on how to align technology investments with organizational goals and risk tolerance. Real-world examples and case studies will be used to illustrate how companies are approaching these choices in practice. Next slide, please. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to briefly discuss some of our current activities at the Massachusetts Export Center. We are part of the Massachusetts Small Business Development Center network, and our office provides free one-to-one advisory services to Massachusetts businesses engaged in global trade, with a heavy focus on global trade operations and compliance. We also operate a special membership-based initiative called the Compliance Alliance, which provides a forum for companies to connect and share best practices in the area of global trade compliance. Our spring training season is coming to a close. After today, we will have only one program remaining. On June 3rd, we will finish our training season with the webinar on convergence of export and import compliance and what it means for trade compliance practitioners and for compliance programs. As Jason mentioned, all participants will be muted during today's webinar, and we will handle questions via the Q&A function of our webinar platform. Please feel free to ask your questions as they arise, and we will present them to our speaker at the end of the program. Next slide, please. And now I am delighted to introduce today's speaker. We are pleased to have with us Leslie August, Chief Marketing Officer with KYG Trade. Leslie is a recognized leader in global logistics and trade compliance with more than 3 decades of experience. Over the course of her career, Leslie has held leadership positions in international logistics, trade services, insurance, and trade consulting, working with companies ranging from emerging businesses to large multinational organizations. Her experience spans supply chain operations, risk management, trade compliance strategy, client advisory services, and business development, with a strong focus on building practical solutions for companies operating across global markets. As a co-founder of KYG Trade, Leslie works with organizations seeking to modernize and strengthen their trade compliance and operational processes through technology-enabled and AI-driven solutions. Her work focuses on helping businesses adapt to rapidly changing geopolitical conditions, tariff environments, and global trade regulations, while improving efficiency and resilience across international operations. Leslie has also been a long-standing advocate for education, mentorship, and leadership development within the international trade community. She is currently serving as president of Women in International Trade Northern California, where she works to expand industry programming, foster professional networking opportunities, and support the advancement of women across the global trade and logistics sectors. In addition to her executive leadership roles, Leslie is a frequent speaker, moderator, and contributor on topics including trade compliance, tariffs, supply chain resilience, AI and international trade, and the future of global commerce. Her contribution to the industry have earned her numerous professional accolades, including recognition as Woman of the Year by the Organization for Women in International Trade. We are delighted that Leslie could join us today, and now I will hand the program off to her to get us started.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here. And Julia, thank you for that very effusive introduction. I'm not sure I deserve it, but I'll take it. So I want to welcome everyone to this webinar. Again, my name is Leslie Levy August. I'm co-founder, Chief Marketing Officer at KYG Trade. We're a SaaS solution for global trade compliance. We're going to dig into the topic of buy versus build. Looking at AI solutions. I'm guessing that many of you in the audience are looking at adopting AI in many areas of your business, and this is just one of them. So hopefully I'll give you a framework and some ways to think about what your decision making should look like going forward. Jason, next slide. This is just a little description of our expertise and background. And I put this in because I wanted everyone to be aware of the deep domain expertise that it takes to develop a solution for trade compliance that's using AI. You can see that our other two co-founders, licensed customs brokers or trade lawyers with a long background in customs and trade. So there's a lot of domain expertise that goes into building a solution, whether it's a third-party solution like ours or something that you do internally. Next slide. So this slide is the reason that we developed our solution. And I'm sure some of you are feeling some of this, that you've got increasing complexity and increasing enforcement and all these governmental regulations that you have to deal with on the import-export side, and yet the systems and the manual systems that we typically have been using over the years really cannot support them anymore. So, this is a kind of a snapshot of the kind of increases in penalties. For instance, if you see the 51 billion in customs penalties, the fourth metric down, it's a 76 times increase from 24 to 25 in the US. And it's not going to get any less. It's not going to get any less. Detentions, right? 3.7 billion a year for suspected forced labor violations in the US. So these kinds of numbers have just skyrocketed in the past few years. And it speaks to the need to up our game on the trade compliance side of our businesses. Next slide, please. To give you an idea of what our platform does, and then I'm going to stop talking about KYG because I want you to have kind of a neutral or objective view of third-party solution versus a build solution. But a platform like ours will provide classification, duty, tariff, FTA qualification, forced labor and screening, documentation, full audit records, and all done with native AI. However, you can see that we always say that professional judgment, legal interpretation, risk ownership, and the final sign-off is never taken over by AI. So we always have a human in the loop. And that's the assumption that we make when we talk about, are you going to build something, you're going to buy something, is it's always going to have a human in the loop when you're talking about regulatory technology. Next slide. Here's one example of what you might be considering building internally. So I'm assuming most of you are focused on exports, given that this is the Massachusetts Export Center webinar. And this happens to be one application that can use AI effectively and help you to have a more compliant export compliance program. So this is the determination of ECCN numbers using AI, where it still goes through the order of review, but it uses AI to answer those questions and get to an answer faster, and at the same time determines or creates an audit trail. So just one example of something you might be considering building internally. Next slide. The key message here is that AI adoption, it's really no longer optional. The regulatory agencies are using it to target. They're using it to find discrepancies and outliers in the data that they have. And they're looking at all, importers and exporters nationwide to see if there's an enforcement action that they can bring. So it's really not a, do we do AI or not? It's really, when do we do it and how do we do it? And that's the decision that we're looking at today. Next slide, please. You're going to have to think about why this matters right now, especially if you're making the case to other leadership in your company. There's got to be a basis for moving forward and making the investment, whether you buy or build. The increasing complexity we talked about, the enforcement pressure, the volume of trade data that is now having to be maintained and audited. It's not enough just to keep the result of your analysis, like the ECCN code somewhere. You need to have the how and the why as well. And AI is transforming all of that. If you're not doing it yet, know that your competitors are looking at it and may already be doing it. So you have to think about the strategic benefits of buying versus building and the speed to market as well, if you're concerned about your competitors being able to manage their compliance better and faster. So we're talking about compliance really moving from a cost center to a strategic function. And it's risen because of recent frequency of changes and difficulty in determining landed cost, for instance. It has moved to a front and center topic for most C-suites these days. And the takeaway here is that whether you decide to buy or build, it is going to impact your risk. So you need to be aware of your risk tolerance, the scalability, and also your competitiveness, which I just mentioned. Next slide, please. So buy versus build, two fundamentally different approaches. You're really talking about, an internal development, creating extensions to your ERP, something it's custom built, and depending upon what ERP you use, will determine exactly what those extensions look like. You can tailor it to your internal workflows, and you control it in-house. So definitely advantages and benefits to look at when you're looking at building something from scratch internally. The buy benefit is it's a purpose-built platform. So you're going to be looking at a platform that's built to service trade compliance professionals. It's built for that functionality. It's going to be specialized. You're going to definitely be able to deploy faster, and you won't have to worry about the innovation cycles. The software developer worries about the innovation cycles. The other big difference is that the vendor manages the regulatory intelligence. So in the instance of KYG, as an example, we have a API into Descartes, which is their customs info product, that updates our regulatory database on a daily basis. You're going to have something along those lines internally, and you'll have to pay for it, maintain it, etc. So that's an important consideration when you're looking at buy versus build. Where are you going to source the regulatory content, and what is it going to cost you to source that regulatory content? Next slide, please. This decision, regardless of what direction you go, is uniquely complex. When we're talking about trade compliance, and this would be true for most any regulatory compliance, trade happens to be particularly complex, but you have to have literal accuracy. When you're using a large language model, an LLM, as I'm sure many of you have heard about, the results that you get when you go out to a publicly available LLM are probabilistic answers. So with an LLM, if you ask the question, or you say, fill in the blank, the sky is blank, and you put that into an LLM, it's going to come back with the answer blue, because it's looking for all the times that that blank was filled in and what it was filled in with, and it's going to give you the most likely answer to that fill in the blank. You can't have that with regulatory compliance. You have to have a standard, an approach that is not probabilistic, but that is exact. So the large language models in this instance cannot be relied on exclusively. This applies if you're building something. You're going to have to not only decide on what your core AI tool is going to be, but you're going to have to modify it. You're going to have to apply other layers of technology on top of the large language model. So you're going to have a large language model, which you're going to be using, but then you're going to have guardrails around it. You're going to use generative AI. You're going to use a technique called RAG, right? So you've got different tools that you're going to have to consider. It's not just, oh, well, let's just pivot to an enterprise version of Copilot or an enterprise version of ChatGPT. It's going to have to be more refined than that. Otherwise, you're going to get very plausible but incorrect output. You're going to get inconsistent results across systems and over time, and you're going to have a lack of traceability unless you build that traceability in. So your evaluation process has to go beyond just evaluating the functionality. You have to be able to accurately defend and audit whatever process you put in place, whatever build you decide to go with. Next slide, please. So here's the framework that I mentioned at the beginning. And these are the 5 critical dimensions that I would suggest you consider when you're making this decision. As we just talked about, regulatory risk and defensibility. Is the system that you're going to buy or the system you're going to build, do they have that built in? Data and intellectual property control. So obviously, if you build, you have total control over your IP, your product data, etc. When you evaluate a buy option, that's a big question that has to be satisfactorily answered. And then you want to look at the total cost of ownership. So it's not just what's it going to cost us to build this year or over the next 2 years, but what is it going to cost us to maintain it in the long term? And the same thing's true for a buy purchase. You're going to want to know what the platform fees are going to be on an ongoing basis. And speed to value. So how quickly can you get from the concept to actually getting value from whatever system you go with, and whether or not you have the organizational capabilities to build it and maintain it. And I mentioned, I've peppered in a couple different comments about you need to have a team, obviously, that has deep domain expertise in trade compliance in your product category. And you need to have an IT team that can maintain the frequency and the velocity of the regulatory changes. So it's not going to be okay if somebody's on vacation on your IT team and the regulations change and your built out system isn't updated till they get back from vacation, because that's going to impact the outcomes that you're using on your internal system. So most companies will just default to the cost of doing it, but really you want to look at also the risk and the operational reality of building something versus buying something off the shelf. Next slide, please. So this is really non-negotiable. I mentioned it before. And if you look down in the orange build versus buy considerations, again, deep regulatory and AI expertise. It can't just be regulatory and product knowledge. It's also got to be AI expertise. And then the vendor must support ongoing regulatory maintenance. Right? So you need to be clear about how often is that regulatory database being updated. Up above on those bullets, these are questions that you would be asking your team internally or an external third-party vendor. Can the output be traced back to specific regulations and timeframes? So in other words, when a determination is made for, say, a classification or an FDA qualification, can you easily find the specific regulations that made that determination and the time frame within which they fit? So you don't want to have a system that is relying on a regulatory database that's outdated and giving you output for today. Are the decisions audit ready and explainable? So you want very, very clear visibility into how the decision was made at every level of decision making to come to a determination. Deterministic rules are purely AI driven. So you're looking at, if you have a lack of traceability, you're going to have audit exposure because no one's going to remember every single thing they did to determine a classification, for instance. And semantic errors can lead to regulatory violations. So you want to be looking at both of these, whether you're buying or building. Next slide, please. So this talks about total cost of ownership. I mentioned it briefly a little earlier. So beyond the initial investment, you're going to be comparing the build and buy decisions based on, if you're building, your engineering and compliance subject matter expert cost, your ongoing regulatory updates, and the infrastructure and model maintenance, right? So you have to build in all the costs associated with development of a software solution and then maintaining that software solution going forward. If you're going to buy, obviously you're looking at the cost of licensing and the cost of implementation, what the integration costs, and then what the cost of vendor dependency is. And you can parse that a bit. So for instance, you want to know how quickly you can get your data if you want your data. Who owns your data? What is your vendor doing with the data? And what happens if you decide that you don't want to use the vendor anymore? What happens to your data? How long is it kept, etc. So the hidden cost you want to be looking at in total cost of ownership is the ongoing regulatory data maintenance. And if you don't maintain it, you're going to have what we call regulatory drift. So this is true, we use this terminology drift in AI technology, where if you don't audit the AI, you're going to get some kind of drift, and it's not going to continue to give you the correct answers. But this is specifically referring to the regulatory data maintenance, that if you don't maintain that, you're going to have regulatory drift, which means that you're not going to be drawing on the correct regulations, and that's going to give you inaccurate answers, or it's not going to be able to come up with answers as quickly as you need them, and they could be inconsistent. So that regulatory data maintenance is a whole function that goes on in the background that needs to be, you need to have SOPs around it, and you need to be paying attention to it on a regular basis. I don't have to tell you how quickly regulations are changing these days. It's unprecedented. And so you need to have somebody in your IT department that's committed to doing that on a regular basis. Next slide, please. So speed to value versus control is often the biggest decision that companies are looking at in the buy versus build decision. You can definitely get to a place where you're getting value from a solution that you buy very quickly. But you're not going to have the kind of control that you do if you build. So that's a trade-off that's going to be driving most of your decisions when you're really looking at what do we want to do here. It's going to be a slower deployment, longer time to return on investment, and higher customization. On the buy side, you can do a rapid implementation, you get an immediate productivity list, and there's less customization initially. Now, I'm going to make a caveat here, because software design has changed, and making changes and customizing things is very different than it was a few years ago. We don't even talk in terms of customization. We talk in terms of configuration. And that's a distinction that you're going to want to make when you're interviewing vendors. What do they consider a customization that is something that you as a buyer are going to pay for to customize their off-the-shelf solution, versus a configuration, which is something that is done during the onboarding process and doesn't require coding, a change request, an additional cost. It's simply, an example might be, let's say you've got 5 business units and you want to be able to track your compliance across those business units. The configuration is, let's make this instance of our solution work for this customer so that they have 5 business units set up within their instance, and it's a few clicks. It's not, oh, okay, well, this is a change order, we're gonna have to pay for it. It's the off-the-shelf version is built for one instance, but if we want 4 more instances, then it's a customization. So you wanna know and understand what is a configurable feature of the software platform versus what is something that requires customization. Another example is customers who do free trade agreements, and when they sign up with a vendor, they've got 2 free trade agreements that they participate in. And then 2 years later, they open up another trade lane and they want to take advantage of a 3rd free trade agreement. Some platforms will just allow you to just turn that one on, and whatever, if you've got capacity under your subscription, you just start using it. It's a configuration. Some solutions, software solutions, that will be a customization or an added feature that's going to add cost. So these are things that you can vet when you start evaluating solutions if you're going to buy, and just kind of note to self about customization is it's not as necessary as it used to be. So you should be able to get something off the shelf that comes very close to meeting your needs. The solutions these days are built to be very flexible. Next slide, please. Organizational readiness, right? Is the organization ready to build? Do you have the AI engineering expertise? Does your trade compliance team or trade compliance professional, your subject matter expert, have the bandwidth to support the build, which could take a couple years even? And do you have the structures in place, governance and oversight in place to manage that compliance build? You're going to need a few things for AI specifically. You're going to need governance around the model. You're going to need human in the loop validation, and you're going to need cross-functional alignment because it's not going to happen in a vacuum. You're going to need product data to be flowing into your model, whether you buy it or build it. And that product data probably isn't under the control, or it isn't owned by compliance. It's owned by some other, might be supply chain, it might be the product side of the business. So there is a burden associated with building and what you're going to need to operate an AI model efficiently, and with a good foundation as you start. Next slide, please. So this essentially gives you, sort of the cliff notes to when it's appropriate to build and when it's appropriate to buy. On the build side, if you have unique proprietary workflows in place that actually create a differentiation for you in the competitively, you definitely want to think about building. If you have strong internal and compliance capabilities, if you've got all those things in place already, you could consider building. And if the long-term control you perceive outweighs the speed to value, then you would want to definitely look at building. If you're looking for speed and scalability, all in, delivered at once, then buying could be appropriate. And regulatory complexity is high and constantly evolving. So in a way, regulatory tech on the trade compliance side sort of defines itself as something that you should buy, but I don't want to exclude the possibility of building because there are situations where it's appropriate. If you have internal limited resources on the SME side for trade compliance or the IT side for AI, then you really don't have a lot of choices unless you want to take 5 years to build something. If you've got limited internal resources, you're pretty much going to be looking at a buy decision for the most part. Next slide, please. So the best decision is context specific. I think that's been pretty clear. And what we're seeing increasingly is organizations are buying the core capabilities and then building around the edges, where it doesn't require the amount of resources. The other thing, and I'll speak from experience here, that we're seeing and that we've taken to heart to change our offering is when we first started, we were going to be a software solution only. So we were going to not offer any services that we would charge for. We would just have our standard, support for the user on the platform and making sure that they're having a good experience. What we found since we started 4 years ago is that more and more compliance teams and companies need humans to help, whether it's humans to help with an implementation or humans to help on an ongoing basis, because they just need to supplement their SMEs with a little bit more support, a little bit more help, take on a project or something like that. Let's say you merge or acquire a company, and all of a sudden your trade compliance team is now doubling the amount of transactions that they need to manage, and they just don't have the bandwidth to do it and to manage the risk appropriately. You might want to consider a software solution that also can offer you some managed services. And so that's the variation that I would say is available in the marketplace today. And that is that you can get a software provider who also can offer you managed services in a specific trade compliance specialty. So a good example is supplier solicitation. So if you're doing restricted party screening, or you're doing supplier screening on a regular basis, and right now you're doing that with an internal team, you could actually outsource that as part of your software and managed services purchase. But you wouldn't be committed to that managed service forever. You could just use it, as you need it, if you will, for a project. You could decide, like, you lose an employee and you still need to have somebody adjudicate false positives for your screening solution. Contact your software provider to see if they have somebody that can provide that service. So it's worth considering if you're going to buy, what other services that are specialized to trade compliance does that software provider deliver? Next slide, please. AI and trade compliance. It's got to be accurate. It can't be close. It's got to be accurate. It's got to be traceable. And there has to be governance around it. And the traceability is really key. The AI solutions that are out there that for trade compliance, if they're good, you're going to see with the press of a button a complete audit trail that you can produce to give to a regulatory agency. If somebody comes knocking on your door or you have an audit, you should be able to press a button and show whoever that regulatory agency is and who's ever knocking on your door exactly how you got to the determination that you did. Right now, what we see, and this is from big companies to small companies, is everything is being managed in Excel spreadsheets, PDFs, attachments, emails, and maybe some SharePoint files. And when there's a question from a regulatory agency, from BIS or from CBP, it's a scramble to pull together all the disparate sources that were used to make a determination. That goes away, it should go away, when you use an AI solution for trade compliance, whether you buy or build. And that traceability would include all the sources that were used to make the determination, the steps that were taken to get to that determination, who did it, what human intervention happened. So let's say halfway through the determination, a human said, no, the AI is going in the wrong direction. I want to redirect it a certain way. I'm going to give it more product information. And then it continues on. All that would be documented. So it's what I call the how and the why that you get to that decision. You don't just have the output You have the whole story as to how you got the output, and that's the traceability I'm talking about. Buy versus build, business and risk decision, not just IT. So I think we've talked about this. It's a bigger decision than just whether or not you have the IT resources. There is risk associated with it. You have to have deep domain expertise, both on the IT and the trade compliance side. And you are going to have to make a decision of how quickly you want to get to value, or whether the control is the most important thing. I have to say, in today's world, the software providers, we're being asked to jump through some very, very serious hoops of fire on the data security, data privacy side of things, and even on the AI side of things. So, for instance, when you ask whether or not the data that the software provider is collecting is used to train the model, you should always get the answer no, right? I mean, that's one of the things that you would typically use as a reason to potentially build. But the software providers can also prove to you that they're not using your data to train their model. And just some of the things to listen for instance, we don't train our model on customer data for a couple of reasons. One is our customers don't want us to. But secondly, our customers' data is not necessarily that good. So we take a different approach, and we train the model on the regulations. And the model can learn the new regulations and then understand what to look for when it gets the product data that's proprietary to the customer, to the user. So it's a slightly different approach. We're not trying to figure out what X company did, over the last 5 years to make this determination and then have the AI duplicate that. We're looking at, what do the regulations want? What do the regulations ask for? And do I have the product attributes I need in order to make a correct determination? And if I don't, that AI agent should be asking a question. So that's a little bit of the business and risk decision that you can be thinking about when you're talking to a vendor, as far as, is my data at risk? How are they using it? How are they structured? How are they training their model, so to speak? And you can find out a lot about what the approach is just by asking those questions and seeing how they answer them. Underestimating maintenance and regulatory complexity is the most common failure point. I would say the regulatory complexity definitely adds a real challenge for companies who are trying to use AI or want to build a tool with AI, unless there's some specific expertise that they have. So our chief AI officer, and I look for this in other companies, like, who is in charge of the AI at the top level, AI governance for the software vendor that I'm considering. And if that person doesn't have deep domain expertise in trade compliance, I have a problem with that. And you should too. You want somebody that understands the regulations and that also understands AI. And that, you've got to have that internally, and you've got to have that if you're looking at a software vendor. I make a distinction between a company that provides software for trade compliance that was established by software engineers versus trade compliance professionals, or trade nerds, as we call them. So there are a lot of solutions out there. Mostly they're point solutions, not orchestration platforms like ours is, but they're point solutions for duty drawback, for instance, or for export classification or for import classification. And a lot of times they were established by people who were not trade professionals to start with. They were software designers or developers. And they saw a problem and they decided that they would come up with a software solution to solve it. That's a very different grounding or foundation for developing a solution than trade compliance professionals who saw a problem and then hired and worked with and developed the AI and software IT expertise to the problem. Because the people that have the trade expertise, those are the solutions that when you look at them, you're going to say, I get this. This makes sense. This is how we typically work. Or I can see how this could work for us because they seem to understand what we're dealing with on the trade compliance side. So understanding that regulatory complexity and where companies can get stuck is really important. And then the maintenance, I know this sounds self-serving, but it's just the truth. I mean, pretty much every trade compliance team we talk to does not have the bandwidth. The IT teams do not have the bandwidth to even do an integration at first. We start with a standalone solution. They can't find the bandwidth to do an API integration. How are they going to have the bandwidth to maintain those regulations on a daily basis over years? Now, I would say on the build side, if you've got a very simple product mix or you're doing commodities or something like that, it's not that complex. And so it might be simple for you, but it really depends, and that's the look at this in context. It really depends on the type of product that you have and whether or not that product would tend to be affected by a change in regulations, right? So, and whether you're primarily exporting or primarily importing or both. So you can underestimate the maintenance, but there's some of you out there that maybe it makes a lot of sense because it's a very simple product mix that you have. You're not dealing with a complex manufactured good, for instance. And then the hybrid approaches emerging as the dominant model. I think we've talked about that. I think of hybrid not only in terms of buying a core solution and building around it, but buying a core solution and supplementing with managed services as needed. So there's a couple different ways to interpret hybrid, but those would be my two interpretations of the hybrid approach, which might be perfect for you. Next slide, please. Actually, jump to the one after this, Jason, if you would. Just quickly, because I want to take some questions if we have them. I threw this in at the end of the slide deck for those of you that are looking at calculating total cost of ownership or ROI. These are the key financial metrics. Some of you may be on the finance side or you may be CEOs. But if not, these are the key financial metrics that your financial people are going to want to see. And I just brought this to your attention when you're looking at solutions and you're looking at buy versus build, that these are the total cost of ownership, the payback period, the NPV and the IRR are all what your finance team is going to want to see. Yeah, I guess you can go back to the thank you slide, Jason. And appreciate your attention. Don't know if there's any questions, Julia, but I'm happy to answer them.
Sure, yes, there are questions, and there's some we got in advance. There's a really good question about using general tools. What are your general recommendations on using the big general third-party tools like Gemini to automate trade compliance processes such as classification? It's kind of in between buy and build in the sense that customization is possible but limited.
Yeah, so the problem with the large language models like Gemini is that there's no guardrails built in. So you don't know if they're using the most current version of the regulations. You don't know if they're making up the regulations. I mean, we've obviously experimented with this, and what we've seen from time to time, not always, but from time to time, is that they'll cite a regulation that they used in the determination that doesn't exist. So it's not being directed to a limited list of websites, for instance. You can try to tell it to go to cross and only pull from the cross rulings, but you can't really see what it's doing. And then once you have that, like let's say you are getting, for some reason, you've got a product category that you're getting good results, you have a classification in isolation, if you will. So now you have this classification, you've copied and pasted it somewhere, but it's not something that's really repeatable. It's not in an auditable record. It's not associated with a product in your ERP. It's just the standalone determination that doesn't give you the ability to slice and dice the data, right? So if you want to do a report on, how many of your products currently have XYZ classification, you can't really do that because you just got a bunch of classifications that have been determined kind of in isolation or as a separate output. But I think the biggest thing, if you're just looking for one-off classifications, you don't have to do anything in bulk, or you don't really have a lot of products that you're classifying, so you don't have a lot to manage in terms of audit trails. You'd be better off going to one of the point solutions and just paying to run something once in a while, because they're at least going to have guardrails around where they're getting the regulatory data, and I know some of them definitely show you an audit trail. They're not going to give you the integration and robust kind of orchestration platform that I'm talking about, but you may not need that.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's a very good point. We do work with a lot of companies that use those tools, but you need to always verify. And of course, you can tell large language models to use certain sources and certain websites. It's cross, as you mentioned. I think that would be at least the step that would make the decisions a little more grounded on the LLM end, but it doesn't mean, again, that these will be correct. So would you think, so you already actually answered the question about specialized point applications versus just general applications like that. There was another a question about it. So you did say that you'd rather go to a specialized application and use it on and off versus using the general model like this.
I would, because you've at least got theoretically trade professionals that are maintaining it and keeping it up to date. And you shouldn't have to feel that you have to verify as much as you do with a large language model. Because really, even if you say only use these sources, and it'll tell you I only use these sources, you still have to kind of check it and make sure that it understood what you were telling it. Because they're trained to please you, right? Yeah, have you ever noticed like any question you put into Claude or ChatGPT? Oh, that's a great question. Like they're trained to please you. They don't want to stop and ask a question. Whereas the point solutions or a solution like we have where it's an orchestration platform, we're going to stop and ask. Our AI is trained. If it doesn't have all the information to make a determination, it's going to stop and ask. So for instance, let's say it does have voltage and voltage is required, but it doesn't have um, it doesn't have some specific aspect of voltage that's required in the regulations. It's not gonna assume, it's gonna stop and ask, is this for commercial or residential use? Because then that determines what the voltage needs to be. Whereas the large language model might just make an assumption and give you an answer without saying, I need to know whether this is commercial or residential.
Mhm. Yeah, so basically they don't ask questions, is a good answer to this. Another good
Mhm.
answer. Um, so basically, what to you would be the best applications for build if it's like the simpler application? I think you mentioned that there was something on classification, for instance, and I've noticed that some of the other AI companies and authorities were mentioning that, for instance, HDS classification is kind of quite achievable on a very precise level. Do you agree with this?
I think actually HTS classification is one of the harder things to do, even though a lot of people are talking about it and some are
Mhm.
doing it. Things like supplier solicitation, that's relatively easy to do. But free trade agreement qualification, um, HTS classification, ECCN codes, um, first sale for export is hard to do. And one thing that's really hard that we're doing is supplier traceability
Mhm.
for UFLPA and other types of supplier traceability because there's no one tool that can do it. We do it with a partnership. Um, if you go with a supplier traceability tool like Caron or Trade Verified or Sayari or Altana, you're going to get a lot of noise with the data that you get and then have to figure out how to parse through it yourself. We do a combination of product level traceability plus we get the data from one of those content providers and then we give it to you in a form that you can use. So that's probably one of the most challenging is the supplier traceability.
Supplier traceability. Okay. Thank you very much. This will be all for questions. We really enjoyed your presentation. Some of the concepts I love, especially such as regulatory drift. That's something I'm going to remember and repeat often. I think at this point, we are ready to wrap up. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise. It was really wonderful to have you present on this very important topic. And now I'll pass the program back to Jason to wrap us up.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Leslie. We hope you've enjoyed the program. Once the webinar platform is closed, you will notice a new tab in your browser with our training evaluation. We ask that you take a few moments to complete this evaluation to let us know if this program met your needs and expectations. Your feedback is appreciated. Thank you for your participation. We hope that you will join us again for future programs.